The woman they called a fraud was standing on Main Street in Dry Creek when Martha started talking. It was a Tuesday in November of 1889, which meant the feed store was open and most of the town was out. Dry Creek sat in Laramie County in Wyoming Territory, a cattle town a few miles off the Union Pacific line where the railroad had first come through Pine Bluffs back in 1868. Men still called that stretch of country the Frontier Crossroads, though the land had settled some since those early days. Martha had a voice built for distance, and she used it. She said Molly had sold her a tin of something that did nothing for her nephew's cough, and she wanted the town to know it. She said a woman who traveled alone with a bag of remedies was not a healer. She said there was a word for what Molly was, and the word was not a kind one. People laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Molly stood with her satchel at her side and did not move. She had a stillness about her that some people read as guilt and others might have read as patience if they had been paying a different kind of attention. She was 25 years old, and she had been standing in streets like this one before. She knew how to wait. Frank was leaning against the post outside the feed store. He watched. He was not a man who spoke into other people's business without cause, and he had not yet found his cause. He had a way of going very still himself, and the two of them, the woman in the street and the man at the post, were the stillest things in town that morning. Then someone came running from the direction of the church. It was Mrs. Holloway, and she was breathless and frightened in a way that had nothing to do with gossip. Her little girl Emma was 6 years old and burning with fever. The child's breathing had gone thin and fast in the night, and nothing Mrs. Holloway had tried would ease it. She was calling for the doctor. Someone told her Dr. Hastings had ridden east 3 weeks prior. He had gone to Cheyenne for the Wyoming Constitutional Convention that had opened in September, and word had come that he had taken a post beyond the mountains and would not be riding the Dry Creek circuit again. The territory was talking of statehood, and doctors, like everything else, were being drawn toward what was growing and away from what was small. Mrs. Holloway stood in the street with her fear showing plain on her face, and the town that had been laughing 10 minutes earlier did not know where to put its eyes. Frank stepped off the porch. He looked at Mrs. Holloway, and then he looked at Molly and said, "Can you help a child with fever?" It was not quite a question. Molly was already opening her satchel. They brought Emma to the back room of the feed store because it was closest and it was warm. Molly asked for clean water and a basin and a lamp brought close. She asked Mrs. Holloway to sit beside her daughter and speak softly. Nothing sharp, nothing that would startle the child further. Frank brought water without being told. He stood at the door so the crowd would stay out, but the mother could stay in. Molly worked the way water moves, no wasted motion. Her hands were not delicate hands. They were hands that had done this before. She cooled the child's brow and listened to her breathing, with her ear close and her eyes closed, still and attentive, as someone reading something important in a language they had spent years learning. She mixed a tea from what she carried and helped the little girl take it in small sips. She showed Mrs. Holloway how to keep the room air moist and how to watch for the moment when breathing eased or tightened. Frank watched her hands without meaning to, the sureness of them, the way they moved without hesitation through something that would have made most people step back. She was young, was the thing that kept occurring to him, young and certain in a way that had nothing to do with youth. By afternoon, Emma's breathing had slowed. The fever had not broken entirely, but it had turned. Mrs. Holloway held her daughter's hand and cried quietly, and Molly wrapped the child's shoulders and said she would come back at dark to check on her. The town had gone quiet in a different way than before. The boarding house had no rooms left. The freight wagons had been delayed 3 days up the road, and the men were waiting them out. Frank told Molly this without apology, more a statement of the situation as it stood. The ranch had a spare room off the kitchen with a cot and a stove, and she was welcome to it until something else opened in town. He looked at her directly when he said it. "I've got a spare room," he told her, "and I don't care what this town says." He said it the way a man says a thing he has already decided is right and sees no need to ornament. Molly looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her satchel. The ranch was 2 miles out. They rode because Frank had his horse at the rail and he brought it around without discussion, and she put her foot in the stirrup and settled behind him with her satchel across her lap, and neither of them made anything of it. The cold came down off the ridge, and the road was frozen hard, and the light was going fast, pulling the color out of the fields before you were ready for it to leave. The spare room was small and smelled of wood and old flour. There was a cot, a stove, a window that looked out at the fence line, and beyond it, the open brown of the winter pasture. The room had its own outside door, which gave the town less to say than it wanted. Molly set her satchel on the floor beside the cot with the care of someone setting down something they would need to find again in the dark. Frank built the fire without asking. She watched him do it. And then she unpacked what she needed for the evening, and he left her to it. Word travels in a small town, the way weather does, low and fast and ahead of itself. By the next day, people knew where Molly was staying, and by the day after that, some of them had found reasons to come out to the ranch. An old man named Castor came with a chest that rattled when he breathed. Molly listened with her ear against his back and her eyes closed. She gave him something for the congestion and showed him how to sit when he slept so it would not settle. He left walking a little straighter than he had arrived. Fevers came, and winter coughs came, and frightened mothers came, and Molly handled each the same way she handled everything, without making more of it than it was. People came and went, and they all wanted the same thing from her: what she knew, what she carried, what she could do, and they left with it, and she returned to her work. Nobody asked where she had come from. She was useful, which meant she was welcome, and she had come to understand that those two things were not the same as being known. Frank observed all of it without commentary, the way she moved through the kitchen in the early morning, the low register she used with frightened people, steady and even, offering calm the way you offer a handhold, the way every instrument went back to its exact place in the satchel without her having to look. He did not remark on any of it, but he noticed. By the end of the second week, the house had found its rhythms without anyone arranging them. He was up before light, and she rose not long after. And by the time he came in from the morning's first work, she had coffee on and whatever the larder allowed. One morning she was at the window with her cup when he came in, looking out at the frost on the fence posts. He poured his coffee and sat, and they ate without ceremony. After a while, he said, "You sleep all right?" She considered it honestly. "Better than I have in a while." He nodded at his plate and did not pursue it, but something in the answer had registered, and she could see that it had. If you are listening to this, and your heart is full, the way mine was when I first heard it, take a quiet moment to subscribe so these stories can find you again. It helps more than you know, and we would be glad to have you walking with us. On a Thursday evening, he came in late, and supper was already on the table, and she was sitting with her notes spread in front of her, reading while she waited. He washed up and sat down. "You didn't have to hold it." "It keeps fine," she said, not looking up. He served himself and ate, and she set her notes aside and ate too. And the fire worked in the grate, and outside the wind had come up off the open country and was making itself known against the eaves. After a while he said the fence on the north side would need a full day before the hard freeze. She asked how long they had. He said maybe a week. She told him Mr. Castor's chest had been clearer that morning, that she thought he would get through the winter all right. Frank looked at her across the table. She looked back. Two people in a warm kitchen with the wind outside and supper between them, and nothing in particular being said. And it had the feel of something that had been going on long before it started. It was one of those evenings just before full dark, the sky going deep blue above the ridge and the cold settling in properly, when Frank came around the side of the house and found her already on the bench along the front wall, her hands in her lap and nothing in them, watching the last light leave the pasture. He sat beside her. He had his coffee, and she had hers. For a while, neither of them said anything. Then he said, "Where'd you learn it, the healing?" She looked at the pasture. "A woman named Ruth, over in Carver County in Minnesota. She took me on when I was 14. He waited. "I grew up at the County Poor Farm there. It was established in 1868, the year I was born. Ruth used to come when the children were sick. I followed her around until she let me help, and then until she let me do more than help. She died when I was 22 and left me her bag and her books. It was enough to start with." The last color was leaving the sky. A horse shifted in the pen and blew out a long breath that hung in the cold air. "After that, I just kept moving," she said, "town to town. People need what I know, and I go where they need it." She said it plainly, without asking for anything in return. But there was something underneath the plainness that said she had never been asked to explain it before to anyone, and did not quite know what it felt like to be asked. Frank turned his cup in his hands. "Must get lonesome," he said. "Town to town." She considered it honestly. "You stop noticing after a while," she said. "Or you think you do." He looked at her then. Not quickly, not sideways, directly, and without apology. The way a man looks at something he has been trying to understand and has finally decided to look it straight. She held it without looking away. After a moment, he looked back at the ridge. He stood and picked up both cups. "Cold's coming in," he said. She rose beside him, and they went inside, and the door closed, and the night settled over the ranch. It was the third week when someone brought the rumor to town. A woman had died, they said, in another settlement under Molly's care. People said she had done something wrong, and a family had buried their mother because of it. Martha heard it first and made sure others heard it second. The women who had brought their children out grew uncertain. Mr. Castor stopped coming by. The warmth that had been slowly building pulled back like water before a frost. Molly did not defend herself. The habit of silence was deep, and she went on with her work. Frank heard it on a Friday in the feed store from two men who did not know he was behind them. He came home and split wood for a long while in the cold, and then came inside. She was at the table with her notes. He poured himself coffee and stood at the window. And the quiet held for a while before he said, "There's talk about a woman dying." Molly set her pen down. She looked at her hands flat on the table. "A mother," she said. "The baby was turned wrong and had been for too long before I arrived. I stayed the whole night. There was nothing to be done by the time I got there, and nothing to be done after. I stayed anyway." Frank looked at her. She did not look away from her hands. "All right," he said. He picked up his coffee and went back to the window. She sat for a long time after he left the room, her hands still on the table. The lamp burned low beside her notes, and she did not reach for them. Tears came without sound, and she let them, because there was no one asking her to be strong just then, and that too was a kind of mercy she had almost forgotten existed. Word came through the postmaster near the end of the 5th week. Dr. Hastings was not returning to the circuit. People stood around that news for a day or two, and then got practical the way people do when the alternative is going without. Quietly, without anyone deciding it, they began bringing things to Molly. A broken finger set and wrapped. a wound gone hot that needed watching, an infant's cough the mother could not calm. When a night call came, Frank rode out with her. He did not announce this as a decision. The first time it happened, he simply had the horse ready when she came out with her satchel. And she looked at him and put her foot in the stirrup, and they went. He waited outside in the cold while she worked, and when she came out, he was still there. And they rode back in the dark without discussion. It happened that way every time after. Martha kept her sideways looks until the night her nephew's cough turned sharp enough to frighten her. She came after dark and stood at the outside door like pride had brought her halfway and fear had brought her the rest. Molly took the boy in, worked until his breathing eased, and sent him home before dawn. Martha did not apologize. She only stopped speaking against her, which, in that town, carried almost as far. It had been a hard week. A difficult birth had kept Molly 2 nights running, and she had come home both mornings gray with exhaustion. Frank had said nothing, only left things where she would find them. Coffee in the mornings, a plate kept back at night. On the Friday, she came home before dark and sat in the chair nearest the fire and did not reach for anything. Frank came in from the stock and found her there. He sat in the other chair and worked a length of leather, and the fire did what fires do, and the house settled around them. After a while, her eyes closed. He went on with the leather. When he added a log and settled back, she had drifted toward him, her head coming to rest against his shoulder with the slow ease of someone who has given up the last of their waking self. He went still. He set the leather on the arm of the chair. The fire worked. The wind pressed at the windows. He sat with her weight against his shoulder, and he knew what this was. He had known for some time. He woke deep in the night, with the fire burned to coals and her breath slow and even against his collar. He got up carefully and built the fire back and found the blanket and settled it over her and stood a moment looking at her face, which in sleep had let go of its watchfulness and was simply a face. And it was a good one. He put his coat on and went out before the light came. She woke late with the fire warm and the blanket around her. She looked at the other chair and the piece of leather on its arm and the fire that someone had tended, and she did not move for a long time. The last of the local herd came down from the high pasture on a Saturday, which meant the gathering in the square that night, which was the custom. Lanterns strung between the posts, a fiddle, tables of food. The men in from the hills with the looseness of people who have finished a hard thing and are ready to set it down. People were talking of the territory becoming a state. Cheyenne had finished its convention work, and all through Laramie County, men were saying Wyoming would join the Union come summer, though nobody knew the exact day yet. Molly went because Frank was going. She wore her better dress and stood where the lamplight reached, but did not insist at the edge of things, the way she had always stood in town after town, present without being seen. Frank came and stood beside her. The fiddle slowed, and the square reorganized itself, and he looked at her. "Dance with me." She looked at the square, at the people already watching from the corners of their eyes. She handed him her cup. He set both cups on the table and offered his hand, and she took it, and they walked out into the lamplight. He was not a graceful man, but he was steady, which in a partner is worth considerably more, and she found the rhythm of him quickly. His hand was at her waist, and her hand was in his, and he was looking at her, not at the crowd, not past her shoulder, at her, with an expression that was plain and certain, and had been a long time arriving. The song ended. Neither of them stepped back. The fiddle started something livelier. Frank looked down at her. "Walk with me." They left the light and went to the quiet end of the street, where the fiddle became something distant, and the cold came off the ridge clean and sharp. Frank stopped and looked out at the dark, and she could see him arranging something. A careful man, putting words in the right order because he intended to say a thing only once. "The town knows it now," he said. "They need what you do." A pause. "I need what you do too. Not the medicine." He looked at her. "I mean the rest of it." She stood very still. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Permanent. As my wife, if that's what you'd want. Not on account of practicality. I want that to be clear." It was clear. It had been clear in the coffee left without comment, and the fire built up before dawn, and the blanket laid over her by hands that tried not to wake her, and the horse waiting outside every house she had been called to in the cold. It had been clear on the porch in the fading light when he asked where she had learned what she knew. The first time she could remember that anyone had wanted to know something about her that was not written in the contents of her satchel. Her hand found his at his side. She put it there against his warm in the cold air. "Yes," she said, "that's what I want." He turned his hand and closed it around hers, and they stood in the cold while the fiddle played on without them. And neither of them was in any hurry to go back. They were married 3 weeks later on the church steps. The sky was pewter, and a pine bough had been fixed to the door because it was nearly Christmas, and that was the custom. The minister was brief because Frank had asked him to be. More people came than either of them had expected. Little Emma was there with her mother, the child pink-cheeked and holding a ribbon someone had tied in her hair. Molly carried her satchel to the steps. At the threshold, she set it down and went inside without it, and the people who saw said nothing. Which was the right way to receive it? When it was done, they came out into the cold afternoon, and Frank's hand was at the small of her back, not gripping, just present in the way of something that had decided where it belonged. They walked home in the early dark. The road was the same road. The cold was the same cold. Behind them, the town settled into its evening. Smoke from the chimneys, lamplight finding the windows one by one. Come spring, the satchel hung on a hook by the door of the small room on Main Street that Frank built out and fitted with a proper door. Martha passed it sometimes on her way to the dry goods, and did not stop, and did not look sideways any more. Which was as close to an apology as the town was going to get from her. And it was enough. On July 10th of 1890, when Wyoming became the 44th state in the Union, Molly and Frank stood on the porch and heard the distant cheering from Pine Bluffs, where the railroad men were celebrating. She thought of Ruth in Carver County and the poor farm children she had left behind, and the long road she had walked alone. She thought of a spare room off a kitchen and a man who had said he did not care what the town said. She leaned into Frank's side, and he put his arm around her without comment, the way he did most things that mattered. Molly worked and Frank worked, and the seasons moved through the pasture and the long road into town. And outside the window of that small room on quiet afternoons, you could sometimes hear the livery horses in the pen 2 streets over, and the sound carried clean in the cold air. And it was a good sound to work to. If this story stayed with you, we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell us where you are listening from tonight. Thank you for sharing this time with us. There are more stories waiting, and we are glad you are here.